The sound of tires crunching against gravel sent a ripple of tension through the air. Jack Lawson sat on his porch, his boots kicked up on an old wooden crate, sipping coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He didn't move, didn't blink. His pit bulls, lounging in the shade, lifted their heads in unison, their eyes locking onto the intruders like well-trained snipers. The front gate swung open, and 3 men in cheap, navy blue uniforms strutted up the driveway like they owned the place. Their clipboards and fake badges might have fooled some poor old retiree down the street, but Jack had seen real authority before. These guys? These guys were playing dress-up. The tallest one, a pasty-faced man with a gut that said he enjoyed HOA meetings more than gym memberships, cleared his throat. "Sir, this property is in violation of several HOA regulations. You have 48 hours to vacate before we begin legal proceedings." His voice carried the manufactured confidence of a scammer who had never been punched in the face before. Jack took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving them. "That's so." The second guy, shorter, with an unfortunate mustache that made him look like a rejected police academy recruit, stepped forward. "According to our records, your residence is not compliant with community aesthetic. That includes the fence, the lawn, and those," he gestured toward Jack's pit bulls, "aggressive animals." Jack's grip tightened around his mug. The dogs, as if sensing the insult, let out a low, synchronized growl. Napoleon, his biggest, a muscular beast with a scarred ear, bared his teeth. Jack set the mug down on the crate beside him. "You do realize," he said, voice even, "that my house isn't in an HOA, right?" The third man, who had been silent so far, gave a smarmy smile. "Not yet. But the neighborhood is transitioning. We're bringing order to this community. You'll want to cooperate. Things can get difficult for non-compliant homeowners." Jack let the silence stretch between them. The heat pressed down, the air thick with tension. Caesar, his oldest pit bull, stood up and padded over to Jack's side, his head level with the seated man's knee. Jack scratched behind the dog's ear, his fingers brushing over the old scars from his days as a rescue. "So let me get this straight," Jack said finally. "You're telling me that, despite the fact I own this property outright, I'm somehow under the rule of an HOA I never agreed to, and you expect me to just hand over my house?" "That's the best option," Mustache said with a condescending nod. Jack nodded slowly. "Huh." Then, without warning, he let out a loud, sharp whistle. Instantly, all 4 pit bulls sprang to life. In perfect synchronization, they launched from their positions, closing the distance between themselves and the intruders in a flash. Napoleon lunged at the tallest one, his massive frame stopping just inches from his knees, snarling. Hannibal and Genghis flanked Mustache, circling him like sharks, their teeth flashing. Caesar simply sat beside Jack, watching, his presence alone enough to keep the last man frozen in place. The effect was immediate. The men stumbled back, their fake bravado crumbling. Tall Gut sucked in a panicked breath. "Call them off." Jack shrugged. "I didn't say attack. They're just standing their ground. Kind of like me." One of the men tried to take a step back, and Hannibal let out a warning bark that nearly sent him tumbling. All right. The leader raised his hands, clipboard shaking. We'll be back." Jack chuckled. Looking forward to it. The men practically tripped over each other in their rush back to their car, slamming the doors shut as the engine roared to life. Jack stood, stretched, and whistled again. His dogs immediately returned to his side, tongues lolling, tails wagging, as if the whole thing had just been a fun game. But Jack wasn't smiling anymore. He watched as the car disappeared down the road, his gut telling him this wasn't over. He had faced threats before. He knew what real danger looked like. That night, long after the sun had set, Jack sat in his darkened living room, watching the security feed on his laptop. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. And sure enough, just past midnight, a shadow moved at the edge of the property. A figure in dark clothing crouched near the fence, a pair of bolt cutters in hand. Jack leaned forward, his fingers grazing the loaded shotgun resting against the couch. He smiled. The HOA might think they owned this neighborhood. But they were about to learn, this wasn't their territory. This was pit bull country. Jack had been in enough fights to know when someone was testing the waters. The fake HOA enforcers had retreated, but not because they were scared off. No, men like that didn't back down after a single failure. They regrouped. They recalculated. They found another way to push their scam forward. That was why Jack wasn't sleeping when the trouble came back. He sat in his dimly lit living room, one hand resting on the shotgun across his lap, the other clicking through the security feeds on his laptop. His pit bulls were curled up on the floor beside him, their ears twitching at every subtle noise. They could feel it too. The air had shifted, thick with the kind of tension that always came before a storm. At exactly 3 a.m., the cameras picked up movement. 2 figures crept along the side of the fence, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. Jack didn't move. He just watched. The men thought they were being clever, keeping low, staying quiet. They didn't realize the ground they were walking on was already a battlefield. One of them pulled out a pair of bolt cutters, lining up the blades against the chain-link fence. Jack exhaled slowly. Amateurs. They didn't even know what they were about to step into. Before the bolt cutters could make their first squeeze, the motion lights in the yard snapped on, bathing the intruders in an unforgiving white glow. They flinched, momentarily blinded, and that was all the time Jack needed. He let out a sharp whistle. The dogs were already moving before the sound had fully left his lip. Napoleon was the first to reach the fence, his deep, guttural bark cutting through the silence like a gunshot. The man with the bolt cutters jumped so hard he nearly dropped them. Hannibal and Genghis followed, snarling, their paws pounding against the dirt. The second intruder tried to run, but his foot caught on something unseen, sending him sprawling face-first into the ground. Jack stepped outside, the shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. "You boys lost." The first guy tried to play tough, straightening his spine as he lifted the bolt cutters. "You got no right keeping us from HOA property." Jack tilted his head, amused. "HOA property, huh? Pretty sure this fence is mine. Just like the land. Just like everything else you're standing on." The second man, still on the ground, was wheezing, struggling to push himself up. That was when Jack noticed what had tripped him. A long, thick garden hose, carefully positioned in the grass. He smirked. Guess his sloppy coiling had paid off. Napoleon took a slow, menacing step forward, his muscles rippling beneath his coat. The first guy's confidence cracked. "All right, man. Look, no need for this to get ugly. We just wanted to give you a final warning. 48 hours, remember?" Jack didn't move. "And if I don't?" The man hesitated. He had an answer, but he was too much of a coward to say it out loud. Jack had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who knew they had power as long as no one called their bluff. Jack had spent his life around men like that, in war zones and boardrooms alike. They puffed up their chests, they threw out threats, but the moment you pushed back, they withered. Jack stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. The intruder took an involuntary step back. Napoleon barked once, sharp and commanding, and the guy flinched so hard it was embarrassing. Jack sighed. "Let me explain something to you. I don't run. I don't negotiate with clowns playing dress-up. And I sure as hell don't scare easy. If you're gonna come after me, you better come harder than this." The guy swallowed, glanced at his partner still struggling on the ground, and then made the smart choice. He turned and ran. The other man scrambled after him, tripping once more before finally making it over the fence. Jack watched them go, shaking his head. He looked down at his dogs, who were still alert, waiting for his command. "That was pathetic," he muttered. Napoleon wagged his tail. Hannibal sneezed. Jack turned back toward the house, but the moment he stepped onto the porch, a thought hit him. These guys weren't just making empty threats. They had a reason for targeting him. No scam artist put in this much effort unless there was real money on the table. And that meant one thing: this wasn't just about his house. It was about a bigger operation. He walked inside, pulled up his laptop, and started digging. The fake HOA had to be leaving a paper trail somewhere. And sure enough, after half an hour of searching, he found it. The group had been running a scam in different neighborhoods for months. They would forge HOA documents, send fake legal notices, and trick homeowners into thinking they were legally obligated to leave. Once the properties were empty, they sold them to developers for a profit. It was a classic con, and it had worked on plenty of people. But Jack wasn't just another victim. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. They were coming back. He could feel it. This wasn't just some random attempt to scare him. They had a plan, and they thought he was just another clueless homeowner who would fold under pressure. That was their biggest mistake. Jack cracked his knuckles and smiled. They weren't ready for what was coming next. Jack knew they'd be back. He didn't know when, but he knew it wouldn't be long. The scam only worked if they kept the pressure on, kept the intimidation rolling until the target either gave up or cracked. But Jack Lawson wasn't built for breaking. He'd spent too much time in places where real threats existed, where the dangers weren't middle-aged men in polo shirts pretending to be law enforcement. These guys thought they were predators. They didn't realize they had wandered into a den of wolves. He spent the next day making sure everything was ready. He reinforced the locks, checked the security cameras, and walked the perimeter with his dogs. Napoleon, Hannibal, Caesar, and Genghis moved in formation beside him, sniffing the air, picking up scents Jack couldn't detect. They knew something was coming too. They could sense it the way animals always did, a primal instinct that had kept their kind alive for thousands of years. By nightfall, Jack was back on his porch, shotgun resting across his lap, sipping on a fresh cup of coffee. He wasn't tired. Years of training had taught him how to function on little to no sleep. His body was at rest, but his mind was sharp, scanning the darkness, waiting for the inevitable. Then, just past midnight, the first SUV rolled up. Jack didn't move, didn't react. He simply watched as the vehicle came to a slow stop at the end of his driveway. The engine idled for a moment, then two more SUVs pulled up behind it. This wasn't some half-baked scare tactic anymore. This was an operation. The doors opened. 5 men stepped out. This time, they weren't wearing fake uniforms. They were in dark clothing, the kind that blended into the night. One of them had a crowbar in hand. Another had a thick duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Jack could guess what was inside. Probably tools to cut through his locks, maybe even weapons in case things got rough. He let them make the first move. They approached the house cautiously, spreading out like they'd done this before. Jack stayed where he was, calm, watching. Then, as one of them reached the front porch steps, he whistled. The reaction was immediate. Napoleon burst from the darkness, a blur of muscle and teeth. The man with the crowbar barely had time to register what was happening before the dog crashed into him, knocking him flat on his back. He screamed, trying to shove the pit bull off, but Napoleon wasn't letting up. He snapped his jaws just inches from the man's face, making it very clear he could end this whenever he wanted. The others hesitated, startled by the sudden attack. Then, from the side yard, Hannibal and Genghis came charging in. Panic broke out. One of the men spun to run, only to trip over a loose stone in the driveway, his arms flailing as he crashed to the ground. Hannibal was on him in an instant, pinning him down with one massive paw. Another guy made the mistake of reaching for his bag, probably thinking he could grab something useful from it. Jack didn't give him the chance. He stood up slowly, raising the shotgun just enough for them to see. "Go ahead," he said. "Try it." The man froze, eyes darting between Jack and the barrel of the gun. The one guy who hadn't been taken down yet, probably the leader, lifted his hands, palms out. "All right, let's all take a breath here." Jack exhaled sharply through his nose. Funny, That's what I was about to say when you idiots rolled up to my house in the middle of the night with a crowbar. The leader tried to smile, but it came out nervous. Look, there's been a misunderstanding. Jack nodded toward the men pinned under his dogs. Yeah, seems like it. You all misunderstood what was gonna happen if you stepped onto my property again. The guy's fingers twitched. He was thinking about running. Jack shook his head. Bad idea, he said. Then, just to drive the point home, Caesar stepped out from the shadows, his deep growl vibrating through the air. He was the calmest of the pack, the one who didn't waste energy barking or lunging. He didn't need to. He was the executioner. The leader's face went pale. Okay. Just let them go. We'll leave. Jack tilted his head, considering. Then, from down the road, the sound of sirens filled the air. The leader's eyes widened. He turned back to Jack. You called the cops? Jack smirked. You think I'd go through all this trouble and not? The man cursed under his breath, but he knew it was over. The flashing blue and red lights cast long shadows across the yard as the police cars screeched to a stop. Officers jumped out, guns raised, shouting commands. Jack didn't move. He just stood there, watching as the men who had been terrorizing homeowners for months were forced to the ground, handcuffed, and dragged away. One of the officers, a guy Jack knew from town, walked up to him, shaking his head. You really couldn't just call us first? Jack shrugged. Had to make sure they got the proper welcome. The cop glanced at the pit bulls, who were all sitting obediently now, their tongues hanging out like they hadn't just taken down a gang of home-invading scammers. You trained them yourself? The officer asked. Jack nodded. The cop let out a low whistle. Damn. Maybe you should start a business. Jack smirked. Maybe. By the time the last of the fake HOA goons had been loaded into the police cars, the adrenaline was wearing off. Jack scratched behind Napoleon's ears, feeling the familiar weight of his pack beside him. They had done their job. As the cars pulled away, he grabbed his coffee from the porch. It was cold again. He took a sip anyway. He turned to his dogs, shaking his head. Boys, they just don't learn, do they? Napoleon huffed. Hannibal wagged his tail. Genghis rolled onto his back, already over it. Jack sighed, taking in the quiet night. Maybe now, finally, he'd get some sleep.